Good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you're located. Welcome to the 6th Annual Mid-Atlantic Regional Conference of the International Center for Academic Integrity. I'm Dr. Camilla Roberts, current president of ICAI Board of Directors, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual conference, Reimagining Academic Integrity in the Moment of Rapid Change. Now, for many institutions, the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically shifted not just the educational landscape, but also how relationships and actions take shape within this landscape. Moreover, continuing patterns of racialized violence and inequities in educational access, preparation, and experiences urge us to scrutinize notions of justice and fairness that are so often at the core of academic integrity efforts at our institutions. So what does promoting the culture of academic integrity look like in this current landscape? How might the current moment shift the way we might think about academic integrity, as much as we want to try and promote academic integrity? We are really excited to explore these questions with you over the next 2 days. I'd first like to extend great thanks on behalf of ICAI's Board of Directors to the conference co-hosts, the University System of Maryland, William E. Kerwin Center for Academic Innovation, and the University of Maryland Global Campus. I'd also like to thank the 2021 Conference Planning Committee, whose names are listed in your program. I'd like to provide a quick overview of the conference program. In a moment, we'll have welcoming remarks from senior leaders at USM and UMGC, followed by our keynote presentation for today by Doug Harrison. Doug is Vice President and Dean of the School of Cybersecurity and Information Technology at UMGC, and also serves on the ICAI Board of Directors. Doug's plenary will be followed by a short break, and then we'll have 2 sets of concurrent sessions. At the end of the day, we will have some time for casual networking, so please make sure you join us for an opportunity to meet other conference attendees. Tomorrow, we will start again at 12:30 Eastern, kicking off with a plenary panel on the topic of academic integrity in a pandemic, reflections from a year on Zoom. We'll have a set of lightning talks, an ICAI town hall where you can learn about ways to maximize your engagement with ICAI, and then another opportunity for networking. Please remember that all sessions have specific Zoom links, which can be found in your attendee program that should have been emailed to you. In sessions, please remain muted whenever you're not speaking, and also utilize the chat function for any questions. Also note that we will be recording the 2 plenaries and also the town hall session. At this point, it's now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Joe Boffman, Senior Vice Chancellor for Academic and Student Affairs at the University System of Maryland, who will offer a welcome on behalf of USM.
Thank you so much, Camilla. I appreciate that. And on behalf of Chancellor Jay Perman and the entire University System of Maryland, welcome to the 2021 ICAI Mid-Atlantic Regional Conference that today has a much greater reach than just the Mid-Atlantic. We're proud that the USM Kerwin Center for Academic Innovation, run by Dr. M.J. Bishop, is co-hosting this conference with University of Maryland Global Campus in a wonderful partnership with the International Council for Academic Integrity. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are made up of 12 four-year institutions and 3 regional centers around the state of Maryland. And in our system, each institution has a great deal of autonomy. The work we do in the system office consists of helping to identify topics that are of interest to people across our system, convening institutional leaders to in fact engage in conversation about those, and then facilitate work in the area. One such area for us has been the focus on academic integrity. In late 2017, our System Board of Regents heard from a panel of faculty, staff, and students about increasing concerns around academic dishonesty. Partly due to the speed and sophistication of emerging technologies, institutions have begun to understand that simply dealing with dishonesty prevention is not sufficient to meet the needs we have of today's learners. These concerns have only been heightened, as Camilla pointed out, in this era of COVID-19 and pandemic, as our resolve to move past dishonesty prevention toward helping students, faculty, and staff, as well as administrators, take very seriously their responsibilities toward academic honesty, while also building an entire culture of academic integrity. At the end of that meeting in 2017, the Regents charged my Office of Academic and Student Affairs and our Council of University System faculty, made up of faculty from all 12 institutions, with exploring next steps that we might be involved in to address these concerns. One of the most immediate and tangible results was for us to have a greater involvement in ICAI. Therefore, we brokered the first ever system level membership in ICAI, bringing all of the member benefits to our 12 institutions and pledging to coordinate a number of professional development and capacity building activities. And I'd like to thank members of my staff, Dr. Zakia Lee, along with MJ Bishop and her colleagues at the Kerwin Center, for leading the system's efforts in looking into academic integrity. I also want to take a moment to recognize USM institutions on the conference program: Salisbury University, Towson University, University of Baltimore, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, University of Maryland, Eastern Shore, and our co-host, University of Maryland Global Campus. I want to thank all of these colleagues for their dedication to this work. For now, I'll close by saying that we are delighted to be the first system member of ICAI. We've been working with our institutions as they do the important work of creating cultures of academic integrity on their own campuses, and reflecting and discussing these issues, sharing best practices and challenges that we can meet together. Now I'll turn the microphone over to Blakely Palmiero, the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Chief Academic Officer at our University of Maryland Global Campus, so that she can provide some words of welcome. I'd like to wish you all very well, stay healthy, and have a wonderful conference.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. On behalf of the University of Maryland Global Campus, I am delighted at the opportunity to welcome all of you to the 6th Annual ICAI Mid-Atlantic Regional Conference. I expect we all wish we could have come together in person today to experience the camaraderie and creativity that professional conferences typically inspire. And I expect that for many of us, the last 11 months feel like they've been one long blur of Zoom meetings. So I commend all of you for choosing to participate in this virtual conference over the next 2 days. Rather than calling it off or sitting this one out because you can't meet in person, you've chosen to sign on for more Zoom meetings so you could participate in this dynamic and engaged community virtually. This is certainly authentic evidence of how important the issues associated with academic integrity are to all of you, and that commitment is nothing short of admirable and necessary to advance this work during a time of such rapid and unpredictable change. You'll hear over the next couple of days from a number of colleagues who represent students, faculty, staff, and administrator perspectives about both the challenge and the opportunity we have associated with academic integrity. Specifically, you will see a theme woven throughout these presentations and discussions that calls on all of us and our institutions to address academic integrity not from a deficit model, but one that is in keeping with our ethos as educators and focuses on supporting curiosity, discovery, and growth, preparing students for engaged citizenship, and nurturing skills and values that are not limited to academic integrity, but have a central place in the social, personal, and professional dimensions of our lives and theirs. UMGC has learned that reflective examination and evaluation of our own mental models must be where the shift in our thinking and action begins. We had at least 2 false starts, probably many more, in our own efforts to ignite an authentically reflective and introspective reimagining of the definition and practice of academic integrity in our institution. It necessarily took a work group comprising stakeholders from all segments of our university community to adopt a definition and philosophy of academic integrity that is now our North Star. Aligned to the ICAI definition and fundamental values, UMGC's philosophy also is importantly rooted in our mission as an open access university, taking into specific account the students we serve, the experience they bring with them to their educational pursuits, and what that means for how we design teaching and learning experiences. It is also directly aligned with our core values, above all, leading with students first. As we engage in the sessions over the next day and a half, I encourage all of us to approach the challenge of affecting cultural, behavioral, policy, environmental, and pedagogical change in our institutions from the knowledge that our students will not do their best learning from a posture of fear. Our institutions can be intentionally designed safety nets that create psychological safety for making and learning from mistakes. We can model compassion, empathy, respect, equity, inclusion, and excellence while simultaneously upholding the values that characterize academic, personal, and professional integrity. I'm especially pleased to be able to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Douglas Harrison, who will build upon these ideas in his address today. I'm sure you've had a chance to read Doug's bio sketch on the conference program, so rather than read that to you, I want to introduce him from a more personal view. I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Doug since he joined UMGC in 2017, and I had the opportunity to witness his approach to leading and facilitating the university's academic integrity work group over the 18 months of their work. I have no doubt that the work group's success and the transformative impact their recommendations are having on our institution are due in large part to Doug's ability to create a space for many voices and many views, the contrarian ones included. In this work, as in all of his work, it was clear how he drew on his own professional experience as student, faculty, and administrator at very different and diverse institutions to surface and explore multiple models and ideas in a concerted effort to create a guiding framework specifically responsive to our stakeholders and our institution. Doug and I have had any number of conversations over the years in which we critically reflect on what it looks like to bring our authentic and best selves to our work every day. In his keynote address today, Academic Integrity as a Driver for Access and Inclusion, he invites all of us to take a step beyond the self and be thoughtful about what our institutions can look like at their best at the intersection of access, inclusion, and academic integrity. With that, I will take my leave and turn the program over to Dr. Harrison. Thank you and have a wonderful conference.
Thanks, Blakely, for such a warm and authentic introduction. I'm delighted to be here both as a member of UMGC and an equally proud member of the ICAI. And I'm glad that you're here. You've taken the time to be here, and I'll echo Blakely's reflections on the importance of that commitment. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You are muted. That was by design, only because there are so many of us, not because we don't want to hear you. So one way that you can interact the conversation throughout my remarks is to put questions, comments, and feedback in the chat. That's the primary mode for managing engagement here in an effective way. My colleague, Dr. Jen Simons, whom I'll talk about a bit more in a moment, will be monitoring the chat as I'm speaking, and she'll be synthesizing and curating your questions and feedback. And then at the end of my remarks, there'll be time for us to look at those questions, engage with you all, and have more of a genuine conversation. So with that, I'm gonna take 2 seconds to share my screen. So when you see me look to the left, that's what I'm doing. And then we'll get started. Naz, can you give me the all clear that everyone's seeing what they should?
Yes, all what you need, please, just the full screen. That's it.
Okay, and
yep,
over there. All right, so I want to start with a story. About one of the first academic misconduct cases, actually, that came through my office when I started at UMGC. I was in a slightly different role than I'm in now. And I supervised the staff who were responsible for adjudication when that case was involving members of the school I was a part of at that time. The case in this story involved a student who typifies UMGC student population. Blakely talked about our being an open access institution, and that really dramatically shapes our student profile. In this case, student was a middle-aged man, a racial minority. He was ex-military. He was a middle manager in a federal agency, and he was pursuing an MBA with us. His case involved mismanaging attributions on a PowerPoint presentation. Specifically, he didn't have any attributions. And the case ended up in my office when staff on my team were seeking advice about how to bring the faculty member around to considering some more educationally developmental responses as opposed to the more punitive approach the faculty member was arguing for. So I reviewed the file. Among other things, I saw some email correspondence between the student and staff. And at one point, the student asked a question that has stuck with me in the years since. Basically, his question was this: why are citations required on a PowerPoint presentation? I've been progressively promoted within the managerial track of the federal government for 25 years on the basis of positive feedback on work product just like this PowerPoint, and now you're jamming me up for it. So there are several things I want to return to in this story over the next several minutes, but I want to start with his question about why are we jamming him up for failing to cite sources in a PowerPoint deck? This happens to be when I first encountered this question. It happened to be around the time that Umgc was undertaking a comprehensive rethink of how it transforms and sustains a culture of academic integrity. And that's the work that Blakely was alluding to. I was leading that effort. And at the time I encountered this student's question, I was working with a small group of colleagues to synthesize feedback from around the institution and draft the statement of our philosophy of academic integrity that Blakely alluded to. Please feel empowered to go Google it and take a look. You can even do that now. We're very proud of it. It grounds everything that we do. It's the North Star that Blakely talked about with respect to our investments in a culture of academic integrity and quality. And it was very hard to write. And I think that's because we had taken for granted that the place and purpose of academic integrity in what we do at UMGC and higher education is obvious. It's self-evident, what the French call a donné, a given. But it's not. And one of the big blind spots that we discovered in our culture of integrity at UMGC was that too often, not only did we assume we as educators hold the truths of academic integrity to be self-evident, a verity, but that students share that assumption and that they automatically understand it and how it translates into the expectations and pedagogical processes in the teaching and learning experience. This student was asking, in effect, why are we penalizing him for not sharing our always already assumptions about integrity and misconduct, especially since the assignment emphasized how it reflected real world work products that you'd create on the job. And there was no evidence that he cheated, only that he failed to cite. That's a problem, certainly, but it's not a reason to send him to integrity jail. Now, we ultimately got to the right outcome in this case, and I'll talk about that more in a bit, as I said. But his question was one of the most powerful propulsive forces in clarifying for me the urgency of shifting the conversation about academic integrity and academic quality away from the deficit model constructs that effectively define integrity as its opposite by treating it as something that we stop and do only when potential misconduct is in play. And this deficit-minded thinking leads to zero tolerance, war on cheating attitudes and beliefs and actions that are still far too predominant in higher ed. And in turn, these reflections really sharpened my understanding of how our cultures of academic integrity and the processes and procedures that put our cultural values into action are, or at least they can be, a driver for access and inclusion. So there's a growing recognition within higher ed that our future as a profession and the continuous renewal, I think, of an educated workforce and citizenry in a free society, it really depends on the collective ability to reach the so-called new college majority population of students. These are typically first generation, often low income students, students of color, military affiliated, working adults, too often that they've been left behind by higher education. These are students with some or no college who have been historically underserved or simply shut out of access to post-secondary education and the economic and social uplift it provides for them, their families, and their communities. I think it'd be going too far to say that higher education has figured out how to comprehensively widen access pathways for these students, but the attainment crisis among new college majority students is increasingly driving the policy ed, the higher ed policy conversation and some of the agenda. Alongside this growing emphasis on access and attainment, there's also clearly an even better established, frankly, consensus, at least among educational researchers and faculty developers, and probably a lot of people in this room, about the centrality of active and engaged pedagogies and andragogy as drivers of success and persistence for new college majority students. and within the ICAI scholar practitioner community, the important links between active and engaged instructional approaches, metacognitive development, and restorative justice responses to scholastic dishonesty are equally well established. Immersing students in meaningful learning, authentic assessments, reflection on their position, and the co-construction of knowledge, all of this equips them with the self-determinative capacities and domain skills that help ensure authentic education and help reduce repeated violations of misconduct when things go wrong. Less well developed is a constructive model for understanding the positive relational value of academic integrity and access to attainment in higher ed. So let me now bury the lead here. Over the next several minutes, my argument is going to be this: the educational practices that are central to cultures of academic integrity have the power to be critical disruptors of inequitable access to higher education attainment for new college majority populations. These students enroll in our institutions often at a disadvantage and at risk of failing and falling into the so-called overmatching gap. That's the shorthand for multi-generational structural inequities in US education, the lack of equitable economic opportunity, and lowered access to the cultural and social capital. They're so critical to navigating the hidden curriculum of higher education. Consequently, that overmatching can, educational psychologists have shown us, activate stereotype threats and other psychological stressors that drive a last resort recourse to academic misconduct. Deficit model paradigms to this still predominate in higher education far too much. And they see in that overmatching gap and its outcomes a regrettable lack of preparation for the rigors of college. Not only do these paradigms often perversely, sometimes implicitly, sometimes even explicitly, frame the effect of systemic injustice as a failure of the student or even entire groups, and they also lead to enrollment bias that penalizes new college majority students for lacking levels of preparation only available to a sliver of the college eligible population, and perpetuates a powerful root cause of educational inequality in the US. Institutionalizing restorative systems of academic justice that many of you are on the front lines of, aligned to culturally responsive pedagogies, flips this script. In the flipped script, the skills gap and achievement differentials that many students bring to college in time management, in note-taking, in research, information literacy, and the development of social emotional intelligence, foundational writing and numeracy skills, all of these things are not signifiers, excuse me, of unfitness for college, and neither does academic misconduct arising from these gaps and differentials primarily attest to a lack of college readiness. Rather, they are indicators for where to focus targeted adaptive interventions that support academic success and metacognitive capacity to learn how to learn and to thrive as students, citizens, and professionals. This is what happens every day in thousands of teachable moments and remedial sanctioning processes at institutions that many of you are responsible for overseeing. But the flipped script goes further to imagine the developmental ethos of the teachable moment and the restorative aims of remedial sanctioning writ large in higher education broadly. Let me stipulate at this point that my remarks and focus here are not on what we might call congenital cheating, that small but not ever entirely vanquishable subset of students who are determined to cheat with impunity and an apparent lack of any meaningful compunction. Instead, I'm talking about the panic cheater under enormous pressure from their family and communities to be the first child to complete college. The student who missed the first day of class because he didn't know that TR on the schedule of classes meant Tuesday and Thursday and missed the crucial details about how to complete that critical first assignment. And that student was me, actually, by the way, or even the student whose story I started with. For these students in the flipped script, institutions leverage their enormous power and expertise and influence to meet students where they are in order to help them realize their fullest transformational potential in life and work. So how do we do this? To quote my friend David Redinger, who's I think maybe here and is certainly the past president emeritus of the ICAI, the shortest answer is to teach better. Inclusive pedagogy, active and engaged learning, authentic assessments, culturally relevant curriculum, all of these things are not just proven to boost new college majority learners' success and lower instances of academic misconduct, they're also just good for everyone. But it's also still the case that these approaches and methods are not evenly present in many disciplinary cultures that determine the student experience in the classroom. And in some cases, they're just missing entirely. And even the best pedagogy can still be beset with implicitly deficit model approaches to academic integrity. In our work at Umgc to craft the vision for our philosophy of integrity, we surveyed faculty and students, we held forums and listening sessions, and one of the biggest insights from that stakeholder engagement was that faculty are deeply, fiercely committed to integrity, no surprise there. And the majority think it's someone else's job to ensure that students are educated about integrity. That, to echo myself a bit ago, it's something to stop and do when students cheat. And then we get back to the really important and interesting stuff. Integrity is vital in this view, but it's something that's achieved inoculation style in one and done bursts, or I guess pandemic times, maybe 2 shots, but brief things of instruction in someone else's class. And in this conception, the instructor's role is detection and deterrence. Students told us something very different and equally important. They see academic integrity as a dimension of a broader investment in their own personal ethicality. And they see faculty as the primary agents of integrity in their teaching and learning experience, how to translate that ethicality into academics. On one level, this tracks with what we know about our students. Most of them are the first to attend or complete college in their family. They've tried and failed at college more than once. They are paying for their education and balancing full-time jobs and families. Often they're on active duty military deployments around the world. They may have hunger and housing security issues. In most educational settings, they've often been the only person of color in the room in many cases, or only one of few. And they've received messages and signals from almost every corner of society at almost every step of the way that they weren't college material. For these new college majority students, it takes immense resources of inner strength and resolve to succeed against the countervailing headwinds of all those collective resistances. And that strength and resolve, joined to a clarity of vision about the future they seek for themselves and their families, is grounded in a personal ethic that, no matter the language they may use, really is a living embodiment of how the ICAI defines integrity, which is as the courage, even in the face of adversity, to 6 fundamental values: honesty, courage, trust, respect, responsibility, and fairness. And these students look to their instructors to understand how to uphold their own standards of ethicality and integrity as academic citizens, how to make that translation I mentioned a bit ago. And this is important because they often enroll with us without a lot of familiarity with the standards and conventions of teaching and learning with integrity. So, with faculty strongly believing in integrity, but not seeing themselves as its primary drivers, and students looking to faculty for signals about how to be an ethical learner, well, if you can't see where this may be leading, maybe there's always a good time for a meerkat or two, so maybe that'll help. To be specific about that, let's go back to the student whose story I opened up with. It's a point of pride for us at UMGC that we use a largely project and scenario-based curriculum built on authentic assessments. Think of these as ripped from the headlines of life and work. And we got that part right in this student's case. He immediately recognized that what he was being asked to do looked and quacked like a lot of the things he does on the job in the line of work he's seeking to advance in by going back to school. The opportunity that we missed was in making the assumption that an adult student who's been out of school for many years nevertheless somehow comes back with a complete and updated understanding of the ins and outs of handling source material and attribution styles and citation rules, and how all of that applies to a learning demonstration like a PowerPoint presentation that is far beyond the classic 5-point essay. Unfortunately, this type of situation plays out across higher ed too often, even as the prevailing trends challenge the sufficiency of how we teach integrity. Most of the norms and the ethical frameworks that define academic integrity in at least Western higher education derive from mostly Anglo-European systems of thought and ways of knowing and being. The centuries-old traditions that still shape higher ed can make it seem like these epistemological traditions have been, have a certain kind of baked-in ubiquity within majoritarian culture in everyday life. That, of course, everyone knows that you have to cite your sources always and forever. But students who don't come from these traditions and cultures, or with cultural capital, are not, for instance, going to intrinsically understand or automatically revere the post-Enlightenment valorization of individuality and originality. And then there's the internet. It seems like there is always the internet these days. Susan Bloom's work is perhaps the most eloquent demonstration that the age of the internet, and especially its pastiche and mashup ethos, its emphasis on melange and open and free appropriation of ideas in any way all the time, those forces are exploding any remaining traces of cultural consensus about the primacy of original work. And this is Bloom's words. The ideal or myth of originality does not drive students. They are more interested in sharing, belonging, resembling, converging, and thus plagiarism, a violation of originality, does not horrify them. It does not cause them revulsion or despair. I want to propose that it is not a surrender of academic values or higher education's commitment to integrity to acknowledge that a diversifying society in an increasingly interconnected world means we can't just keep doing what we've always been doing and hoping for better results while the ground shifts under our feet. It will do us no good, for instance, to admit and enroll greater numbers of diverse students if we only then stigmatize them as cheaters for not knowing rules and standards we aren't giving them the opportunity to authentically learn and understand. That doesn't mean that we stop requiring students to cite their sources, even on a PowerPoint. What it does mean is that we have to be intentional about the conversations in every class that focus on what the expectations are and why those expectations exist in the first place. We don't ask students to cite sources in a real world deliverable because that's what will happen on the job. Of course not. But too often, we also are not clear, and we don't explicitly surface in every class with all students the socially necessary, educationally beneficial, and professionally valuable reasons for why academic integrity matters and how we ensure it, which includes citational practices. And those vary across disciplines and fields. So you can't assume that there's just a one-size-stop inoculation shop that will prepare students for the prismatic varieties and complications of academic pathways that our institutions provide for them. That is all on us as educators. So in this flipped script, we would have relied less in that story I started with on syllabus language about points deducted for faulty citation and would have recalibrated the emphasis on punitive consequences for failing to cite. Instead, a class would have included a specific instructionally designed activity around the place of citation in graduate business education. And that teaching and learning activity would have specifically helped the student understand that learning how to formally document source material in class will ensure that the underlying values of academic integrity, at the very least, honesty, responsibility, and fairness, those will translate back to the workplace when the student is on the job and the citational frameworks are taken away. And when we make this kind of pedagogical maneuver that students, that we meet students where they are, we're dramatically increasing the chances that students will know how to meet the expectations of quality academic programs. They will feel a sense of attachment and belonging to the classroom, that they will care about what they're learning. And we know that that attachment and sense of belonging is a critical metacognitive factor in disincentivizing academic misconduct students engage in when the stakes don't seem high enough for them to warrant authentic work. The platinum-plated question in all of this is, how do we get from where we are as an institution and a profession to where we seek to be? At UMGC, we understand it as a question about cultural transformation, but in practice, we really draw heavily on the approaches of organizational change and change management. This is higher education, so as Blakely said, we wrote a very long report with footnotes, and we cited our sources naturally. It laid out an analysis of where we were at the time, what was working, what wasn't, and where we wanted to go to align our culture of integrity with our mission, our learning science, the research on integrity, and our learning model. The report functions like a roadmap. This is a roadmap of Washington, D.C., where I live. And because I haven't been living there for a while, I'm putting that there because I miss it. The philosophy of academic integrity at UMGC, that statement that Blakely mentioned and that I encouraged you to Google a bit ago, is what we use to guide decisions about resource allocation, curriculum design, policy, technology decisions related to academic integrity, all encompassing. I would probably lose my position on the board of ICAI as well if I didn't also note that the ICAI tools available on the center's website were critical for our ability at UMGC to self-assess in that early part of the process and really ground our work in an authentic understanding of our culture and where we wanted to go. This work takes time. We formally began our initiative almost exactly 4 years ago today, and we project, based on the research and experience from other universities, that we have at least another 2 to 3 years of project-based work related to our original roadmap that was the result of that 18 months of work that Blakely described. But there really is no other way to make authentic, meaningful change to organizations without doing the work of listening and responding and researching and analyzing and planning and making clear what we're doing, where we're trying to go, and what each group's stake and involvement is in that process. Taking this much time and approach is, for instance, the only way that we at UMGC would have been able to build and make the case for a new 5-member team of professional case managers and analysts in a new Office of Academic Integrity and Accountability within the Chief Academic Officer's office. Lots of offices there. The Chief Academic Officer is Blakely, from whom you heard earlier. And that positioning was really central for us to give it high visibility across the university and consistency. Some of my colleagues from that office, including its leader, Dr. Jen Simons, who's also our moderator today, are presenting at this conference on some aspects of their work, and I encourage you to attend if your schedule permits. Dr. Simons and her team really are the kind of curators of that North Star vision, and they're the ones who help us see how to put it into action in all matters of academic integrity and authenticity across the academic enterprise. And among other things, she's led a stem to stern overhaul of our academic integrity policy. You can Google that too. We'd love for you to click on it. It's not just for policy nerds. It's a model, I think, for what inclusive policymaking and procedural frameworks can be. For institutions of higher ed, policy and companion procedures are how values are translated into action. They have to be preceded by meaningful community engagement and input in order to be successful. But these types of big policy changes are the ground rules for how institutional culture can take shape and be transformed. Our policy development process was infused from the beginning with a primary goal to move away from adversarial and criminalistic frameworks and toward more inclusive and equitable approaches to a policy that educates students and empowers them to learn through the adjudication process. The goal of this shift was to align our approaches to academic misconduct with our values and vision, but it specifically was designed to minimize the risk of purely punitive processes that stigmatize new college majority students as cheaters when the circumstances and evidence do not support a finding of malicious cheating. Briefly, I want to talk about 3 particular features that are critical drivers of the cultural change that we've been seeking. Not because they're brand new or that we were the first to invent them, but because it was important for us to put them together in a way that was culturally relevant to our situation. Before academic misconduct cases are formally submitted for adjudication, faculty now consult with a manager in the Office of Academic Integrity and Accountability. The manager works with the faculty member to understand the situation, and they determine together if a case should go forward. It's hard to overstate the transformative impact of this consultation process. By introducing an intentional opportunity for faculty to reflect together with a trained expert in academic integrity and educational development, the policy introduces an intentional pause in the process before taking the significant step of formally alleging student misconduct. Faculty consultation with a case manager ensures a trained and independent perspective helps surface the various tricky factors and contexts and intersecting perceptions that stand behind the decision about whether to initiate a case or not. And this is especially valuable when demographic or identitarian differences between the faculty member and the student increase the possibility of implicit bias creeping in. One common outcome of these consultations is a decision not to initiate an adjudication, and instead for the faculty member to engage with the student in a teachable moment. This pathway is the second important aspect of the new policy. The teachable moment, which many of you understand and I support, it really allows pathways to be built into the policy and allowances to be made there. This option materially reduces the number of unnecessary adjudications, and we know that when we defer more to teaching through the underlying skills gaps that drive non-malicious cheating, the more we avoid the risk of derailing students with stereotype threats to their persistence through counterproductive adjudications. The final feature I want to highlight is the remedial sanction, another built-in feature of our new policy. Here, we've created a middle way between, on the one hand, the informal resolution through teaching and learning for lapses arising from first time and out of skills gaps, and on the other hand, necessarily serious and punitive sanctions for more severe types of academic misconduct. Policy documents the mitigating factors that help determine the choice of the most appropriate sanction, as well as what educational remediation might entail. Of course, not all of these practices are new to us, and many of you know them well. Indeed, for those of you who are academic integrity administrators responsible for overseeing academic misconduct processes and systems, I want to be very explicit and clear in saying that the work that you do to consult with faculty, to guide and nudge and advise and consult, and especially all the cases that don't ever happen because of that work, that is teaching. And this type of approach to inclusive education is what it means to teach better, or at least it's one way to teach better. And I thank you for that work. More importantly, every time we're able to redirect the process toward educationally developmental activities, the teaching and learning is going on is not just with students, but it's also learning and mentoring with faculty. And in turn, the recalibration slowly over time of how faculty approach students and misconduct cases through these consultative interactions creates a space to engage in next level discussions about how to make curriculum and assessment more inclusive. For instance, for us, how do we ensure that projects and scenarios that drive our curriculum include the widest possible spectrum of identities and backgrounds and situations? Students need and they deserve to see themselves in the stories through which they learn. Or how do we introduce resubmission policies and revise late grading policies that move away from deficit model and zero tolerance and toward growth mindset practices that help all students and are especially critical strategies for retaining new college majority students? This has not been a flawless or pain-free process. Some faculty have been reluctant to fully embrace the new consultative approach. By far, the vast majority of faculty, of course, work extraordinarily hard to support students and understand where they're coming from. But some faculty resistance to this change is understandable, especially for faculty who take what you might think of as and is often called the tough love approach in responding to potential misconduct. This shift is not just procedural. It involves core aspects of how they understand and actuate their self-concept as a faculty member. There's also been some confusion with the new policy that mostly translates into the need for improved support resources for faculty and students, the wraparound guidance with the policy and procedures. So for instance, we overhauled the academic integrity tutorial that we use to include modules on how to collaborate with integrity. And so we hope help students avoid the pitfalls of using those nefarious commercial websites that encourage cheating in the name of peer-to-peer and tutoring support. But we realized we also need to provide students with clearer, more specific explanations about why it is wrong to download and use others' work from those commercial sites, and what the difference is between legitimately using exemplars to understand expectations for an assignment versus submitting others' work as your own. Our new tutorial, which by the way is licensed and openly licensed by design, and it's out there for you to take a look at. We do that pretty well there. We know that we have room to grow in terms of how well the policy echoes and reflects that language. Our policy development process included an independent external review to identify any implicit bias and inequity that we didn't catch, but we're still finding places in the policy where it's frankly more law and order than we would like. And finally, we still don't yet exactly know how the policy is affecting students because we haven't asked them. But part of our evaluation plan involves both objective data collection on changes in trends and outcomes post-policy, and a survey of students to understand how the policy may be changing their perceptions and attitudes and beliefs and behaviors. Many of my colleagues in this work will know that I often describe the inclusive education process as building the ladder of scaffolded learning by which students realize their goals and access the transformative potential of higher education. What most of my colleagues who've heard me bang on about this don't know is that that story has a particular origin for me. And I'd like to close my remarks with you today by sharing that story with you. Early in my career, I spent many years studying and writing about American gospel music and its contributions to the cultural lexicon of the US and to 20th century religious and vernacular music cultures. One particularly powerful spiritual of enslaved people in the US South that dates back to the 19th century is called "We Are Climbing Jacob's Ladder," and it remains popular today in sanctified church traditions. If you don't know the song, you can find it online. Please go look for it. My favorite version, there are many, but my favorite version is by Bernice Johnson Reagan, and it's on her album called River of Life. And by the way, Johnson Reagan, it sings in 4 and 5 and sometimes 6-part harmony here, and she's using all of her own voice for all those overdubs. It's astonishing. The song musicalizes the story from the Old Testament of Jacob's dream, in which he sees a ladder going up to heaven and angels are traveling back and forth between. In the Black gospel tradition, the song is a collective expression of the will to persevere, to persist, and climb up from and out of the depths of enslavement and its legacies in Jim Crow and today's white supremacy. And it was a central image in the civil rights movement. About the time I was finishing an article that introduced non-specialists to the history of gospel music in the US, this was years ago, I had also just started a job as a faculty developer. And I found myself looking for a metaphor to illustrate what's at stake for students when we simply put learning outcomes on the table without giving students multiple supported opportunities to practice the skills that we seek to teach them and hold them accountable for learning, whether it's on summative assessments in the classroom or through academic misconduct proceedings. And so, as with many of the serendipitous epiphanies that are one of the lifelong rewards of academic work, I thought of Jacob's ladder and its promise of a way up and out. And so too is it, I think, in this work. The promise and responsibility of inclusive education is not to do the climbing for our students. Rather, it is to build the scaffolded educational laddering in the learner's life that becomes our students' means of ascent. Thank you very much. I would obviously be remiss if I did not cite my sources, and I think these will be available. There's hot links behind all of these in another form. And I'd love to have some time to engage with your feedback as well. Jen, how's it going over there in the chat room?
We do not have any questions yet, but we encourage folks to submit their questions into the chat or other commentary. There was a comment that some of these remarks that will be helpful for some efforts coming up with or in play with the CUSIF group of Blakely's welcoming remarks and our philosophy.
Yeah, for non-Marylanders in that work, there is a part of the comprehensive strategies we're trying to develop in the system include taking a look at our system policies, which are kind of umbrella guidance to all of the 12 institutions for their companion policies. And part of that is involved going back to that academic integrity, not just one policy, there are several that implicate. But we've tried to be a good player in that at UMGC, and the Systems Alliance with ICAI ensures that we're aligning that work effectively.
Yes. And part of our UMGC policy team has met with that policy team as well. All right, we have a question here. I'm wondering if you or your colleagues have implemented any strategies for enhancing students' initiative and proactivity when advocating for themselves during honor code allegations.
Jen, I'm actually going to see if you want to take your first stab at that, since you're on the front lines there.
Well, you know, really one of the major features besides the elements that Doug noted in our new policy is enhanced due process for students. And so we have multiple touch points where students can ring in, where first when they're notified, first of all, if it even becomes a case. And so we've actually instructed our faculty to not use misconduct language with students and to keep the teachable moment coaching skill focused. And an example of that is when they say that there's an issue with text similarity with outside sources, you know, the real issue is that students are not showing their own thinking and writing. And so the part where it may become to the level that it becomes a case, so our due process is when a student gets notified that there's a case, they have an opportunity to respond to the case notification with a summary of what is possibly found. The words possible misconduct are important in that notification to students. Another key feature is our summary of evidence that is provided to students. And so our analyst, investigator, and case managers work together to create a very descriptive account and summary of what the issue is for the student. So it's laid out in detail with side-by-side examples. And then the student has another opportunity to respond to that summary. There might be a revised summary of evidence, and then the student has yet another chance to respond. And that all happens before a decision is made. The other piece is that for our remedial sanctions to support student development and student learning, the most frequent sanction is instructing the student to rewrite the work for partial credit and to do an activity for educational remediation. So those are some built in terms of coaching students on violations. We think a lot is built into our language and our process. We went through, not only reviewed the policy for implicit bias, but also to make sure it's as understandable as possible, while also still having the fidelity it needs to have to be a policy that our legal affairs team would approve and work in the way that it needs to in that way, and in the language that we use to communicate with students and with faculty. And so we've made it as user-friendly language as we can possibly make it. And we have taken out any legalistic language that we can possibly take out. So we have a way that we're advocating for students in that process. And so I hope that partially at least answers your question about the way we approach things.
I'm gonna, since we've switched roles, I'm gonna play moderator, Jen, and ask you to extend that a little bit, because there's a related question about in that consultation or in the process of consultation, what happens when the instructor and the case manager they're consulting with don't see eye to eye on the process? So maybe you could just talk about an example or two there.
Yes, we have had some, and I think something that we remember about faculty approaches is, one, it's based on experiences they had themselves as students at an earlier time and place, and that they might have had at other institutions. So we know that most students and faculty are coming in with a judicial type of a framework from the more traditional model that they've experienced. So we do understand they're coming in with that. Our step is to, where there's a discrepancy, is to educate faculty about, if we think that it would not be filed as a case, why we would consider it a teachable moment. And we have a very descriptive decision chart that we use and that we provide for faculty that goes from one side, that more towards teachable moment, and a middle column, possibly teachable moment, possibly towards a case consult, and then much more towards a case consult. So we steer faculty back. An example is one discussion post. So if we hear something about a single discussion post, elements of that are that it's low stakes assignment. And especially then we take into account what the course level is, what the student experience is in higher education and at UMGC. We take into account, is it part of a scaffolded assignment where the intention is to provide students feedback early on in the assignment process, and other types of contextual factors. And these are in our policy listed as mitigating factors that are considered. So when there is a disagreement, our policy does say the decision is ultimately up to the case manager, but it is also our job to steer faculty back to understand the context that we're using to make those decisions.
I see Nancy, while you're regrouping, Jen, thanks for jumping in there and saving me. I see Nancy ask a question about how we try to connect the philosophy and the work with integrity with our hiring process, and how do we socialize new faculty and staff for this approach? I think it's an excellent question. And I guess my short answer would be, we're working on it. I think part of what we got right with the philosophy is how strongly it aligns to our mission and our learning model, the sort of ways we integrate learning science into responding to our students. Part of what, in fact, Blakely and I and some other colleagues were just on a call earlier this morning where we were talking about one of our priorities really now is to go back to something like a faculty expectations process and mutually build some consensus around what our baseline expectance we expect from faculty in terms of how to engage and support students. And inevitably that has to integrate especially some of those principles and concepts that are at the end of the philosophy that sort of go from the conceptual to the practical, right? Sort of the accountability balanced against the need for learning through failure. And I think that ultimately then has to translate into how our job descriptions frame who we are as an institution and what we seek from faculty. Now, I'm not going to suggest we don't do any of that today, but I think we all realize that this work has been one reminder that we need to continuously renew the vitality of that voice with which we address ourselves to potential new colleagues, and that we include these components of our values in the discussions that we have throughout the life cycle of the academic enterprise. And that's always something that we're learning how to do better, and get more perfect at.
And I can say that in addition to our new academic integrity tutorial, we have a new module in development about to be reviewed for our new faculty training.
Since we're just kicking around roles here, Jen, do you mind if I take a question that I see here?
Go ahead.
Marwar Ghaffar, thank you for joining us, and thanks for your question. Asks about whether or not this approach actually did promote integrity across the university, and how do you assess the improvement? I think that's one question articulated in slightly two different ways. That's absolutely the right one. I think that we would say, I would say, I think anecdotally, we think that the combination of a number of different initiatives, of which the philosophy and the revision of our policy was one, as well as the academic integrity tutorial, the establishment and visibility and material operation of Jen's office and her team in the Office of Academic Integrity and Accountability, the symbol and substance of our comprehensive investments around that. I think we'd like to say anecdotally, at least, that we've changed the focus of the conversation a little bit and toward the more positive and constructive dimensions that we'd like to see across the operation. But I think it's too soon to say if we've, if actually we've succeeded, or at least are succeeding. I think it's always probably going to be a present progressive in these matters. And part of the evaluation plan I mentioned that Jen and some of our other colleagues, some of whom I think are here with us today, have developed in a collaboration with our academic quality unit, which is where our evaluation experts sit. They've helped us are helping us construct an evaluation plan so that we can begin to collect the right kinds of data points. Understanding things like cultural change in quantifiable ways can be difficult sometimes. I mean, there are some top line metrics we'd obviously want to look at around case trends, and we can survey students, as I said, and we're going to do that with faculty. But more, I think it's in the quality of those interactions that are going on within Jen's team and our faculty, who are really grappling every day with how to do the right and best thing for this particular student in this particular situation. So that's a slightly long-winded way of saying, you and we can watch this space, because we plan to watch it carefully. And I think it may give rise to, other conversations in these kind of spaces, as well as maybe some publications that we can contribute to the profession about what we've learned.
A question to you, Doug, from Krista Morrison. Admirable process of inclusion, wondering if students from different generations are also considered, Gen Y, Gen Z, etc.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, our student demographic, I think what you heard from Blakely and what I hope you heard from me as well, really drives everything that we do. And though there is just a bit of younger skewing dimension to our population over the last, say, half decade or so, it's still very squarely, averagely a sort of mid-30s working adult from one of these new college majority, sub-demographics I talked about. And while we always, I think, are keeping our eye on what we can know about generational trends, I think our online modality tends, combined with our demographic subset for the demographic subset of our students, really means that we get students who the most important thing to know about them is really the effects that an almost entirely digitally disintermediated educational experience is going to bring. And so part of our research has been, in the lead up to this academic integrity work group process that we actually did some publication on, was, does age difference does account for any substantial or statistically significant differences in self-reported online cheating patterns, for instance, to get to kind of implicitly in your question about generational differences. And our answer was a little bit, but only insofar as adult students tended to seem to have less tendency toward misconduct behaviors. More for us is really understanding the effects of the trends that Bloom is talking about in terms of how the internet is sort of exploding notions or any consensus around originality or authenticity. Now, how that trend plays out can have some generational flavors to it, absolutely for sure. And we want to try to be as aware of that as possible. But the research in that area is pretty persuasive that trend of sort of the exploding norms of the mashup cat meme effect of the internet is really transgenerational. And so that doesn't mean we shouldn't be cognizant of those generational differences, and our learning model has to be attuned to them where it's material for us. But we're as much interested in what are some of the sort of dominant effects in how we think about integrity and authenticity that internet culture is introducing across generations.
Here's a question that we might go chronologically. How do you communicate to faculty that students see them as the primary agents of academic integrity and that it's not magically being taught elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Inevitably, this is something we know we want to do more of. I think, first of all, the academic integrity work group's long report with all those footnotes I talked about, it's really been, I think, one of the reasons, to the extent that this work has succeeded, and I don't want to suggest that it hasn't had its pitfalls and missteps, it's impossible not to, but to the extent that we have had success, one of the critical factors was that we've had executive level, visible, vocal support for this work from our president and our chief academic officer from the beginning. And so one of the ways that we tried to open that line of conversation was with the distribution of that report and its key findings to all of our faculty. I think partly, though, we had to do some capacity building. We've had to do some capacity building, and that reflects largely in Jen's team. Part of our future, I think, as we think about how our Office of Academic Integrity and Accountability can be a leverage point for us, is our vision there. And Jen's, she's going to talk about some of these things at this conference. Let me also plug the ICAI International Conference that's coming up in next month. I think she's on the bill there too. She's talking everywhere, in other words, about some of the ways that their team is working to be not just the center of adjudication, but really integrity influencers and helping share this conversation with faculty. The short answer, though, and I know you think I probably never have one, and that's maybe a fair criticism, is that I think the primary place that message is coming across is in the conversations that managers are having with faculty. And it's probably never just the same message in exactly the way I put it, but it's coming up as an ethos that we operationalize and mobilize in the moment, a critical moment where we're deciding which path are we going to take here. And implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, I think, when we're making the decision to really take the growth mindset and the educationally developmental path, we are fundamentally putting faculty members in the driver's seat of being that agent of integrity, because they're really ultimately the ones who bring that the potential of that pathway alive for students.
Great. And I'll update that and have another question that is asked that's related, that we recently sent out through program directors. So we communicate to program directors communicate out to faculty, and provided faculty with a one-pager. And this, Carl Burkhardt asked about professional development opportunities for faculty and how do they learn to raise these with students without making the students angry or defensive. And so we have multiple types of webinars, but recently we sent out a one-pager to faculty. And one of the sections was called How to Promote Integrity. And so we had bullet pointed lists for ways that faculty can promote integrity in their classroom, which is an indirect message to them that they can do some things that they probably never thought were related to integrity, like their response time and questions to students, and helping students anticipate assignment guidelines. There's all kinds of things, and it goes back to the Teach Better message of that. And we have offered a number of different webinars ranging from how to use our new procedures, but all the way to big picture questions like the science of behavior change and what's likely to have lasting and meaningful change in students' lives. So I am sorry, missed a question here. We've gotten some compliments for you, Doug, about sharing the approach. And especially, showing our humanity to each other is key, especially important in online platforms and virtual meetings. So thank you for sharing. Oh, and also thank you for sharing your musical interests. And Someone will text, and somebody else, Amanda McKenzie said, really like the notion of reframing the way you approach what we would typically label as an offense. And not just leading it that it's a plagiarism charge, but looking at it as the skill that it represents. We got two questions that I'll combine, and this is more a question about how we do things in our office, but also the philosophy behind the policy about, do we track teachable moments? And does it go in a student's conduct file if a consultation comes to the OAI and it's not filed as a case? And the answer is no. And this might shock some people who are used to tracking all student behaviors and all student possible violations. And if teachable moments are done, the worst that's going to happen to a student who tries over and over and over again, but keeps slipping to skill, is that they're going to get taught, and they're going to get taught over and over and over again. And what happens too is the context changes. The more experienced they become as students, maybe the similar behavior later is seen as more serious because they're a more advanced student and are expected to have advanced past the point that they were in an introductory class. And Doug, maybe you can speak to some of this. Was the part of the philosophy, not in our philosophy statement, but the philosophy that was the foundation for the policy about the teachable moments.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the importance of it not being part of even a record that we did that, and then we had a great deal of conversation about that. Some of our colleagues are here, and some I don't think have been able to join us, but there was a small group of us who sort of sequestered ourselves for what felt like eons of time in small rooms to talk about these issues. And there are academics there are administrators, there's Jen's and her team's perspectives, there are policy experts, there are legal people, and we're all sort of talking about these things. And I remember that conversation explicitly because I think I ended up arguing multiple points of it before I came to the consensus that we all ended up sharing around not documenting that. On the one hand, it's sort of the data guy and the cultural change guy who wants to have really powerful evidence-based stories to tell. I wanted to be able to say, we did 30,000 teachable moments over the last year. That would be great, right? But then we have really inadvertently, and through what is probably a kind of backdoor deficit model, we've tagged that teaching and learning experience, the cognitive, emotional, and social dimensions of the learning that happened. We tagged it as something that had to do with academic misconduct. And we've really substantially, and I think negatively, colored its orientation for the student and the faculty member. And when the teachable moment route is the pathway that comes out of that consultation, our hope and our guidance is really that the faculty member is going back to the student and having an extended conversation, mentoring, coaching, facilitating the learning around how to close the skills gap, and that it isn't a conversation that goes something like, I just talked to the Office of Academic Integrity and Accountability, which everyone hears integrity jail in these conversations. And oh, by the way, we're not going to give you a case. We're going to instead go have you do this exercise. We hope that's not what's happening, right? That we're empowering faculty to go back into the classroom and do what it is that faculty want to do and do best, and that's teach, and not get absorbed into adjudication. So in that spirit and that sense of philosophy, small p for us in this case, it was really important not to inadvertently signal that teachable moments arising from what a faculty member might have initially thought could potentially be a misconduct case, that it not get sort of nudged over into that side of the Venn diagram, that it stays in its separate space and is really part of the customized teaching and learning that we provide for students when we meet them where they are.
We had a couple of related questions about repeat violations. And do we have data about students who've had a restorative opportunity? We don't yet. Our policy just went into place in August. And another related question was about academic integrity violations within a course. And something we do encourage faculty, if there are repeat issues, if students had a teachable moment early on and continues to repeat the behavior within that course, we do recommend they consult with us so we can look at the context of that. But if a student has risen to the level of having a case, that is when we do have it in our system and we will know if it's a first case or a subsequent case. Fortunately, we do have access to the prior policy cases, so we can retrofit our thinking about what that violation was before and how we would have handled that now sanction wise, and then go forward with a more restorative approach with sanctioning, even for students who've had prior violations. And a quick question about remediation activity. Do we have ethical decision-making activities? Yes, we do. We have 4 areas: academic integrity, personal ethics, getting help, getting appropriate help, that is, and self-care and time management. And those are based on the case manager communication with the student and what seems to be the most prevalent issue that led to the student taking an unauthorized shortcut.
Jen, could I jump in just on Gina's question that you just asked? And thanks, Gina, for the question. It's a good one. Toward the end of your question, you used sort of an example here about the difference between someone who's sort of what I call kind of malicious cheating, making the decision to be dishonest, versus someone who needs better writing support. And you use that word unintentional plagiarism at the end. And this was really another one of those moments that well, more than one moment I remember in those small rooms with a bunch of different, smart and good people having really intense conversations about the policy and I'm sure many of you on this call have had versions of this conversation about, how do you frame the decision about case adjudication or not in terms of intent? And while inevitably, when you're in that consultative conversation or you're making these judgment calls, no matter your stakeholding position, if you're in a deciding role, there is inevitably some judgment that we're probably have to make on the totality of available evidence. It was important for us to, in the policy, and in this case, thinking of it as when a student needs to access it, it's not just a policy, it's an educative document that's really teaching them how the process is going to bring them into these next few steps. It was important for us not to talk about intent. First of all, from a purely legal perspective, our legal team, I think, was very helpful in articulating for us the need for us to be on the solidest possible ground in terms of our evidentiary basis once we have a formal case. But also for the student who goes back down the teachable moment route because we've decided it's what, Gina, you call unintentional plagiarism in your comment. Again, it's back to my earlier comment about not wanting them to think that it's just a sort of, watered down flavor of some other kind of sanction. It's really important that we don't judge the intent of a student, especially when we're wanting them to see that we want them to learn. It's more important to keep even though we have to make a judgment at some level, absolutely. We want to keep the conversation, the teaching and learning process focused on their learning and not, perceived to call them into question. And one of the reasons that's so important is getting back to the question of stereotype threat. A previous institution I worked at was another access-oriented institution, but a small liberal arts, social justice college that was focused primarily on African-American women and Latinx women from the District of Columbia and the surrounding region. We had lots of intense conversations about the place of similarity detection software in our commitment to integrity. And I will say Umgc is an institution that uses Turnitin. We have a good reason for that. And I don't want to inadvertently take the conversation down the Turnitin hole because we've got good questions here. But I do want to illustrate that the stereotype threat question with that example, because we ultimately decided not to use it because too many of our students told us they had so many people tell them, you're not only you're not good enough for college, but we don't trust you to be a college student. You don't have the judgment. You're not a good enough person to even be an academic citizen. And so the first time they turn in an assignment for us as a freshman at our university, and we automatically put their assignment through what most students think is a cheating detection system, even despite our best messaging. That signals to them that we don't even know anything about them. It's the first day of class, the first week of class, and we're gonna assume that they're cheating. That is an enormously detrimental psychological and motivational impact on their sense of belonging to a community that cares about them and really wants them to succeed. And instead sort of, says, we think you might have had an intent to cheat, even if you didn't think you knew that. We know you better than you know yourself, in a really awful way. So moving away from the questions of intent really is not just a question about legality, though that's an important point in terms of evidentiary basis. It's really important when we get to questions of supporting a growth mindset and an educational orientation toward our students' development as academic citizens. Thanks for letting me go on there, Jen. I had a little bit of an evangelistic moment. I apologize.
hey, it's right in line with all of the messages. So we had a procedural question from Pam Pringle about, have we had situations where faculty attempt to bypass the consultation process and try to just sanction the student? If so, how have we handled this situation? We've had some things arise in consultation where a faculty says, I assume I'm just going to give them a 0 and move on. And then we share with them, no, actually, we're going to look at the whole case. Case manager is going to review this. But we have learned, we've been contacted by a couple students here and there, but that they have been accused of academic misconduct. And we follow back around to educate the faculty member and to get that on track in our process. If we don't know about it, we can't handle it. But the intention is to, where we know about it, and also this is part of our keeping our communication loop going with our program directors, with the other academic staff in our schools, to have other staff trained in understanding our process. And so we hope it's handled through education. And if we learn about it, then we get it back on track. And a comment from Renee Caesar: as a member of an older age group of returning school students, I've not thought of cheating as an option. It was more important to learn how to cite quotes and citations. And prior learning 100 years ago, she says, haha, we did footnotes, and it's not even a conversation today.
Yeah, if I could, well, I've already done a little bit of my my shtick about citations, but it really there's a whole other conversation to have about how we treat citations or make assumptions about citations, and that everybody already gets why they're important. I just think it's such a site of fetishistic intensity in higher ed around, fixating on the actual place of the comma in the citation, and never, well, no, I shouldn't say never, I'm being cynical, not enough emphasis on having the first order conversation about why citational methods at all, right? And that was sort of the one of the things I learned from that story. I sort of returned to a few times in the conversation before. So I think it's, I agree, Renee.
We had a couple of questions about restorative sanctions and do we have a retraining class? And our restorative sanctions are assignments for students to rewrite material in most cases. We also allow faculty the discretion, and this is where we hope to address Pam Pringle's question, that faculty know they do have some leeway themselves to deal with low-level issues. And I'm working on an analogy that's not quite formed, but I'm thinking of the equivalent of going 3 miles an hour over the speed limit. Types of things where technically you're in violation, but the smaller things is to redo. So faculty may assign students to rewrite and assign a small deduction, which is smaller than anything that we might assign. So the rewriting process we think is very important for a couple of different reasons. The main one is the student has an opportunity to do the work the way that the work needs to be done to address the guidelines for the assignment and address the expectations with some coaching language from the faculty. The other piece is, if a student is in that small number that Doug was talking about, there are always small number of students who are, quote, trying to get away with something or, out to cheat. It's such a small number. But if they were, this pauses them out. It does not allow the conveyor belt to go on by just assigning a 0 and moving on. This is a moment to pause and to take stock of what a student is doing. The other one is through our educational remediation program to have students do some reflective activities, some metacognition, in areas that we think will help them develop further. And if it seemed to be an ethical question, is connecting their personal ethics to their choices and closing that gap for them. There has been some survey data where students, their personal ethics are somewhat disconnected in their perception to their academic integrity behavior. And so those are designed to close that loop. In cases of stress and time management, we want to help students take better care of themselves and better prepare for what's ahead. Our students take on a heavy load with the work they're doing, their family lives. As Doug mentioned, many of them are active duty service members. And so we want to help them have tools and strategies to move forward successfully.
And I just want to jump in on an aspect of Victoria's question. She asked one of the restorative justice or sanction questions. And I think Jen provided some examples there, but I wanted to sort of put some pause on the computer coding question or comment you asked or made, Victoria, about, you see a fair amount of plagiarism in computer coding. I think it's a really good point to put a little more pressure on. I alluded earlier in the remarks to the different ways that common values about academic integrity, how they play out in different disciplinary contexts, and computer code is probably the most complicated and best example of that, right? So, what an English class would say is how you mobilize honesty and fairness and responsibility in doing a close reading of a piece of literature would emphasize, the courage to assert your own ideas and fairness in pointing out other people's ideas and citing the sources that you do quote. And all those sorts of things that sound pretty familiar to us, right? In computer coding, there's equally a commitment to honesty and courage and responsibility and all of those 6 values, but it plays out very differently, right? So I've got a computer coding spouse, and we talk all the time about how powerful a tool Google has been to very much on the fly, when you've got a coding problem, go out there and find how other people have solved that problem and, integrate that back into the problem you're trying to solve. And I think that's where, if we just assume, that's a good example of where if we just assume that someone else upstream before the student has gotten into the computer science major or wherever the coding might be, they've gotten all the academic integrity instruction and learning they're going to need to know how to navigate what's the difference between finding good exemplars online and not living up to the expectations of the assignment that's trying to teach you some ability to really move through a particular problem that would be thwarted if you just went and found out how someone else solved it. They're not going to have any of that disciplinary specific instruction on how those values, those 6 values, are enciphered and play out in the disciplines. And that is why it's so critical that if you're having a problem with plagiarism in computer coding, yes, we know that that's a challenge that the internet has brought with us, so that's one driver. But another driver could be that there aren't enough intentional conversations going on in computer coding classes about when it's okay to integrate someone else's example, because creating an original code isn't the point. And when it's not okay to do that, because the skill that's being taught really relies on the person having gone through all of the cognitive and intellectual and skill building dimensions required to code the solution themselves. And if we don't have that expectation, then we can't expect our students to know automatically how we want them to learn effectively in that very specific field-based context.
All right, we're going to wrap up with an appreciative comment from Candace Sue. Thank you for talking about these very real issues of systemic bias for students of color. This needs to be acknowledged more broadly across the academic community. So, Doug, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you to everyone. Have a great conference. I can't tell you how glad I am personally that you're here, that we are as a university to be part of this with you. Let me just leave you with this thought. And I'll go back to gospel music, right? I grew up playing the piano in gospel contexts and studying right about it and listening to it. One of the most important concepts that, gospel really taught to jazz actually is that often it's the notes that you don't play, and it's the tune that you don't sing at a particular moment. And I think that lesson is so important when we think about the reflex in higher education to try to adjudicate our way out of a perception of a misconduct problem. So you all are so attuned as people who are above averagely engaging and thinking about this to know where the grace notes need to be and to bring that back to your institution and really, endeavor to persevere as the champion and super agent of intelligent responses to integrity that we know you are. Thank you all so much. Have a great conference. I look forward to talking with you all more whenever I can.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much to Doug for your really thought-provoking presentation, and for you and Jen jumping in and discussing the questions. And we appreciate those participants for jumping in and asking those questions. This really has set the stage for a great conversations for the next 2 days and really beyond. At this point, just a reminder, there will be a short 15-minute, well, a little bit over 15-minute break. The next session will begin at 2:15 Eastern. So thank you all for joining today.